If you can't control your wife, the older woman hissed, then you're not my son anymore. And just like that, she turned to the young bride and snapped, pack your bags. This is my house, not yours. But the daughter-in-law didn't flinch. She looked her straight in the eye and said, then you just made two mistakes. One, thinking you own your son. And two, thinking I needed your house to survive. What happened next? No one saw coming. Before we continue, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Now let's dive in. The wedding had been beautiful, all smiles, music, and glowing blessings. Grace had walked down the aisle with hope in her chest and faith in her heart. Daniel had looked every bit the loving husband, gentle, attentive, and respectful. And to be fair, he was all those things. Except for one flaw. He had never learned how to say no to his mother. Mrs. Agnes, a tall, sharp-tongued woman in her early 60s, was the type who didn't just give instructions. She expected them obeyed before she finished her sentence. Widowed for over 2 decades, she had raised Daniel on her own and, somewhere along the way, began to believe he was not just her son, but her second chance at life. Her extension, her voice. And Daniel, out of deep respect, never pushed back. Grace had heard whispers during their courtship, friends warning her about Agnes's iron grip. But Daniel had always brushed them off with a boyish smile. She's just protective, he'd said. She means well. She'll love you when she gets to know you. So Grace had believed him. Now, 3 weeks into marriage, Grace found herself sitting beside Daniel at the family dining table for a weekly dinner with Agnes. The air was thick with polite tension, the kind that wears pearls and serves it with soup. So, Agnes said, cutting her grilled chicken with precision. Grace, when are you going to stop playing dress-up and start dressing like a wife? Or are you still stuck in honeymoon pictures? Daniel chuckled awkwardly. Grace smiled tightly. She wanted to respond. Something witty, something dignified, but Daniel's gentle squeeze of her hand under the table said, let it go. She let it go. But something inside her took note. She was new to the house, but not new to womanhood. And she could already tell. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a territory inspection. And Mrs. Agnes had no plans to share her crown. The first morning in her new home, Grace woke up early, just as she'd always done growing up. She wrapped a scarf around her head, tied her robe, and headed toward the kitchen to prepare breakfast for Daniel. But when she walked in, she found the kitchen already bustling. Mrs. Agnes stood at the center, dressed immaculately in a satin wrapper and slippers, directing the housekeeper like a general in battle. Add more pepper, she said without tasting. And don't forget Daniel doesn't like his eggs runny. Grace, she turned suddenly, spotting her in the doorway. Why are you up this early? You should still be sleeping. Or, was this your way of trying to impress me? Grace blinked. I just thought I'd make something for Daniel myself. Agnes raised a brow. How thoughtful. But this kitchen doesn't run on thought. It runs on routine, which I've maintained for 25 years. She picked up a tray, perfectly arranged with tea, fruit, and toast. And if you really want to help, you can learn the pattern. I don't do chaos in this house. Grace smiled politely, but inside, she was already reading between the lines. This wasn't help. It was a warning. Later that afternoon, Grace attempted to decorate the living room, adding a small flower vase and adjusting the throw pillows. By evening, they were gone. Replaced. Exactly as they were before. She walked into the kitchen again to ask the housekeeper why. I'm sorry, the woman whispered. Madam said everything stays the way she arranged it. She likes control. And she had it. Over everything. She picked Daniel's meals. Managed his accounts. She even paid the housekeeper directly, from his wallet. That night, Grace sat on the bed beside her husband. Daniel, is this still your home? Or are we living in hers? He looked up from his phone, uncertain. It's just how things have always been, babe. She means well. Grace nodded slowly. But the truth was clear. Mrs. Agnes didn't just live in the house. She ruled it. It started with something small, a grocery list. Grace sat in the kitchen, pen in hand, checking through the pantry. With Daniel's preferences in mind, she added a few healthier options. Oat milk, whole wheat bread, grilled chicken, brown rice. Simple changes. Mrs. Agnes walked in just as Grace handed the list to the housekeeper. What's this? She asked, snatching the paper midair. Just a few grocery adjustments, Grace replied gently. Daniel mentioned he wants to start eating cleaner. Agnes scanned the list and raised an eyebrow. Oat milk? In this house? Is he a cow now? Grace chuckled lightly, trying to keep the air light. No, just trying something new. I thought it might be good for all of us. Agnes folded the list and placed it on the counter with a loud tap. This house doesn't need changing. It needs order. And I already provide that. Grace took a breath. I'm not trying to undo anything. I'm just asking to have a say in the home I live in. That word, home, seemed to strike a nerve. Agnes stepped closer. Listen, Grace. This may be your husband's house, but I built the man you married. I know what he needs before he says it. Grace met her gaze calmly. And I respect that. Truly. But he's not just your son anymore. He's also my husband. And that means I need space to care for him, too. For a moment, the kitchen was silent, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the soft flutter of curtains. Agnes didn't shout. She didn't curse. But her smile faded. And in its place came something colder. I see, she said quietly. You've found your voice. Grace nodded. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to live as a wife, not a guest. Agnes turned and walked away, but not before muttering. We'll see how long that voice lasts. Grace exhaled slowly, her heart steady. She hadn't declared war, but she had just drawn her line. The shift wasn't loud. It was subtle, strategic. Mrs. Agnes didn't shout or argue anymore. She simply inserted herself into everything Grace did. One morning, Grace came downstairs dressed for her first client pitch since the wedding. A modest cream blouse and tailored black trousers. She had recently reopened her interior design consulting after the wedding break, and this was her first big meeting with a high-end client. Mrs. Agnes took one look and scoffed from across the dining table. You're wearing that to a meeting? No earrings. No color? You look like a bank teller. Grace smiled politely. It's just a soft pitch, not a gala. Agnes didn't let up. When a woman is married, her appearance speaks for her husband. If you go out looking tired and dull, people will assume he's not feeding you well. Daniel, caught mid-sip of his tea, said nothing. Grace adjusted her purse on her shoulder and gave a light nod. Thanks for the input. She walked out. Later that week, Grace made jollof rice for dinner, one of Daniel's favorites, spicy and smoky just the way he liked it. But before he could take his second spoonful, Agnes set her fork down. This isn't how it's done in our family, she announced. My son was raised on real food, not burnt-bottom pot rice. Grace laughed softly. That's the firewood flavor. Daniel used to say he missed that. Used to, Agnes emphasized. Back before his wife started feeding him smoke. Daniel chuckled nervously. It's actually good, Mom. Really. But Grace noticed how he didn't defend her fully. Not with his tone. Not with his eyes. The final straw came days later. Grace received a call from a luxury hotel asking for a design proposal. It was a huge opportunity, one she had waited years for. Excited, she mentioned it during lunch. Agnes raised an eyebrow. Design work? Again? Shouldn't you be thinking of children now? Or is career more important than family in your world? Grace's smile froze. Agnes didn't wait for a reply. She simply sipped her tea and turned the page of her magazine. Control had a new language now, not orders, but disapproval. And Grace understood every word. The next Sunday afternoon, Grace walked into the living room wearing a flowing wine-colored dress and low heels. She had just returned from her client meeting. The hotel pitch had gone well. She was glowing with quiet pride. Mrs. Agnes looked up from the sofa, her glasses perched low on her nose. So, this is the new uniform now? Out and about every day while your husband sits at home waiting for cold food and a quiet house. Grace didn't flinch. She set her handbag down gently, removed her shoes, and walked to the dining table. Daniel had lunch at the office, she said calmly. And the housekeeper cleaned today? Everything is in order. Agnes laughed dryly. So that's your answer? Grace turned to face her, her voice even. My answer is that I'm balancing both. I've not abandoned this home, but I haven't abandoned myself either. Daniel walked in from the hallway just as the words hung in the air. Agnes turned to him quickly. Did you hear that? Your wife says she's not abandoning herself. As if marriage is a solo mission now. Daniel looked from his mother to Grace, unsure of where to land. Mom, please. Let's not make everything a battle. I'm not fighting, Grace said softly. But I do have the right to work. To grow. I support Daniel in everything he does. I only ask for the same. Agnes stood up slowly, her voice laced with warning. In this house, a wife submits. That's how I kept my marriage. Grace stepped forward. And where is that marriage now? She asked, not cruelly, just truthfully. Daniel's face tensed. Agnes's eyes flashed. But Grace didn't raise her voice. She simply picked up the file she had left on the table. I'll be upstairs. She walked away with dignity, her heels silent on the staircase. Daniel rubbed his forehead, sighing deeply. Agnes turned to him. You see? This is what happens when you marry women who think respect is optional. Daniel didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew Grace had shown more respect in her calmness than his silence ever had. The silence after Grace went upstairs was thick enough to choke on. Mrs. Agnes paced slowly around the living room, arms folded tightly, her jaw clenched. Daniel sat on the armrest of the couch, eyes fixed on the floor, rubbing the back of his neck. She talks too much, Agnes said finally. Far too much for a woman under this roof. Daniel exhaled. She wasn't rude, Mom. Agnes spun around. Not rude. Did you hear her tone? That was defiance. You think a woman like that will give you peace? Keep letting her speak over you, and you'll be sleeping in the guest room of your own house within a year. Daniel stood. That's not what's happening. Agnes interrupted him, voice sharper now. You were raised better than this, Daniel. I didn't carry you for 9 months, raise you with scraped knees and empty pockets, just to let another woman come in and challenge everything I built. Daniel's face tightened. Mom, this isn't about control. Oh, but it is, she snapped. And if she won't listen to me, she doesn't belong here. The words hung in the air, bold and final. Daniel froze. Agnes stepped closer, her voice now low, deliberate. I've watched that girl from day one. She's quiet. Yes, but not submissive. There's a fire in her eyes I don't trust. And if you don't cut it now, she'll burn your marriage down from the inside. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. What do you want me to do? Simple, she said. Choose your peace, or her pride. He didn't answer, and he didn't need to, because silence, in that moment, was its own decision. Agnes sat back down, victorious. But what she didn't know was this. The rope she was pulling was beginning to snap. The living room was quiet again, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Upstairs, Grace was silent, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. She hadn't come down for dinner, and he hadn't gone up. Mrs. Agnes emerged from the hallway with the confidence of a queen returning to her throne. She walked over and sat across from him, folding her arms. I've made it clear, she began. Now you need to. Daniel looked up slowly. Can't we all just find a middle ground? There is no middle ground when your wife is trying to dethrone me in my own son's house, Agnes said sharply. She disrespects my word, rearranges my home, and now challenges everything I say. It's her or me. Daniel swallowed hard. Mom, don't do this. Agnes leaned forward. Oh, I've done enough, Daniel. I've done the birthdays alone, the school fees, the nights I didn't eat so you could. I built this family with my own 2 hands. And now I'm watching you let someone else walk in and redraw the rules. Daniel rubbed his forehead. She's not trying to erase you. She already has, Agnes snapped. Look at how she looks at me. Like I'm the past. Like I should stay quiet because she wears the ring now. She stood slowly, her voice low and final. I won't share authority in a house I helped build. So you decide. Do you want the woman who carried you? Or the one who talks back to me in my own living room? Daniel didn't speak. But in his silence, the air shifted. Agnes turned her back to him, as if she already knew the answer. And somewhere upstairs, Grace sat quietly by the bedroom door, listening to the man she loved, being asked to make a choice no real man should ever have to make. Daniel stood outside the bedroom door for several minutes before knocking. His knuckles hovered mid-air, hesitant, like the guilt already sitting in his chest. He could hear the faint rustling of pages inside. Grace was reading, probably pretending not to feel the storm building downstairs. He finally knocked. A soft voice replied, "Come in." Grace sat by the window, a novel resting on her lap, her bare feet tucked beneath her. She looked up with tired eyes, not angry, just waiting. Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't speak immediately. He just walked over to the desk and leaned against it, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. "I need to talk to you," he said. Grace placed her book aside. "I figured." He took a deep breath. "Things are getting tense." Grace raised an eyebrow gently. "Tense didn't start tonight, Daniel." He nodded. "I know. I've been trying to keep peace. Trying to keep both of you from clashing." Grace stood and walked over to him, voice low. Daniel, your mother doesn't want peace. She wants power. And every time you step back, she steps forward. Into our space. Into our choices. Into our marriage. He rubbed his hands together anxiously. She's threatened, Grace. I'm all she has. And what am I? She asked quietly. That question hit deeper than he expected. She gave me an ultimatum, he admitted. She says either she stays, or you go. Grace's jaw clenched, but she didn't speak. Daniel looked up, eyes pained. I just need time. Time to sort things out. She's emotional right now. Maybe if you left for a while, just a few weeks. Grace's eyes widened slightly. You want me to leave my own home? Not permanently, he rushed. Just until things calm down. Just to create some space. For peace. Grace nodded slowly, her lips trembling, not with weakness, but restraint. Peace, she echoed. By asking your wife to pack her bags while your mother keeps her slippers in the living room? Daniel looked down, ashamed. She stepped back. You're not asking for peace, Daniel. You're asking me to surrender. I just need you to trust me, he whispered. I did, she replied. That's why I married you. Silence filled the room. Grace walked to the wardrobe and opened it slowly. She didn't slam anything. She didn't cry. She just folded a few clothes, placed them neatly in a small suitcase, and zipped it shut. Daniel didn't move. She walked to him, placed her wedding ring gently on the table beside him, and said, when a man is ready to protect his home, he won't have to choose between love and loyalty. He'll know how to honor both. Then she turned, pulled her suitcase to the door, and walked out without looking back. And Daniel? He sat down on the edge of the bed, the silence around him louder than anything his mother had ever shouted. The sun was just beginning to set when Grace stepped out of the house, her suitcase rolling quietly behind her. The evening air was cool, the sky brushed with streaks of orange and fading blue, beautiful, peaceful, misleading. Because inside her, a war had started. Mrs. Agnes watched from the upstairs balcony, arms folded, chin lifted high. There was no apology in her eyes, only triumph. The kind that believed it had won. Grace didn't look up. She didn't give her the satisfaction. The driver, visibly confused, jogged toward her. Madam, should I? I'll call a cab, Grace said gently. Thank you. She didn't need a scene. No last minute please. No tears at the gate. She walked to the corner of the street, past the perfectly trimmed hedges and the garden she had planted with her own hands, past the welcome mat she'd once picked out. Home is where the heart is. Funny how hollow that line felt now. She reached the sidewalk and stood under the streetlight, phone in hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she booked the ride, but her expression remained calm. A text buzzed her screen. Daniel, please just give me time. I didn't want it like this. She stared at the message, reading it twice. Then she turned the phone off and slid it into her purse. Somewhere behind her, a curtain shifted, Mrs. Agnes again. Watching. Always watching. Still believing that control was a crown. That silence meant defeat. But what she didn't know was that the silence Grace wore now wasn't surrender. It was preparation. Because when a woman walks away calmly, it's not because she's weak. It's because she's decided she will no longer beg for space in a house she helps build. The cab pulled up quietly, headlights brushing over her pale face. The driver stepped out to help with her luggage, but she shook her head and opened the door herself. She got in, gave her new address, a small apartment across town she had quietly leased months earlier, just in case. As the car pulled away from the mansion, Grace didn't cry. She didn't look back, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap, because now she would rebuild, and not just her life, but her voice, the one she'd muted to make a fragile man feel strong, the one she'd softened to keep a mother-in-law appeased. That voice was returning, and this time, she would not lower it again. The house hadn't changed, but everything felt different. The curtains were still drawn each morning. The housekeeper still polished the marble floors until they gleamed, and the meals arrived on time. Yet, there was a chill in the air. It wasn't the weather. It was the absence. Grace was gone, and the silence she left behind had weight. Daniel sat at the dining table one morning, staring at a full plate of food. His mother, as always, was seated across from him, sipping her tea, flipping through a magazine like nothing had shifted. Eat, she said without looking up. You need strength. Daniel pushed the fork around his plate. Everything looked perfect. Eggs cooked just right, toast golden brown. But it didn't taste like anything. Not because it was bad, but because it wasn't hers. Grace used to hum softly while she cooked. Sometimes jazz, sometimes gospel. She never asked him what he wanted for breakfast. She just knew. She always remembered how much pepper he liked, what days he preferred oats over bread, and when to bring coffee instead of juice. Now, the food was fine, but everything else was empty. Later that afternoon, he returned from work and stepped into the living room. The throw pillows were back to their stiff, showroom arrangement. The scent of lavender, which Grace used to sprinkle lightly on the curtains, had faded. The flower vase she'd placed near the window was gone. His mother had moved it the same day Grace left. He sat down on the couch and scrolled through his phone, almost by instinct. No messages from Grace. No missed calls. Only a memory of her soft voice saying, "When a man is ready to protect his home, he won't have to choose." He stood abruptly and walked to the kitchen, hoping distraction would help. Mrs. Agnes was there, instructing the cook. When she saw him, she smiled. "Better, isn't it? Quiet. Peaceful." Daniel didn't respond. Because for the first time, he realized quiet wasn't peace. Not when it was soaked in regret. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The bed was too wide. The air too still. No rustle of Grace adjusting her pillow. No midnight laugh when he made a dry joke. No arms wrapped around him at 3 a.m. Just a perfectly made bed, and a man wrestling with the sound of his own cowardice. Grace had left without raising her voice. But somehow, her silence was what echoed loudest now. The apartment was small, but it was hers. Grace stood in the middle of the studio living room, sunlight pouring through half-open blinds. A second-hand couch hugged one corner. A foldable desk stood near the wall, and her mood board, once buried in a closet during her marriage, now took center stage. Swatches of fabric, color palettes, hand-drawn sketches. It was more than paper. It was purpose returning. She had cried the first night she moved in, not out of regret, but release. And when she woke the next morning, her first call wasn't to Daniel. It was to a client. By week 2, she'd printed business cards. Graceful spaces, interior styling by Grace Hartman. She used what little she had left in savings to pay for a basic website and ads. Every item she sold on Facebook Marketplace brought in another cushion for her new life. She marketed herself quietly. No begging for handouts, no pity posts. Just work. And slowly, clients came. First, it was a friend of a friend who needed a studio makeover. Then a couple who wanted a modern nursery. Then a real estate agent looking to stage 3 apartments. Within 6 weeks, her schedule was booked solid. She worked late, sometimes skipping dinner. But it was different now. The exhaustion came with a sense of freedom. Her hands weren't just cleaning anymore. They were creating. Every room she transformed became a reflection of the home she once wanted to build. One afternoon, while organizing a client's living space, Grace received a text from her bank. Nigerian Naira 2, 850,000 deposited. Description, final payment, Project Vista. She stared at the screen for a moment, not shocked, but proud. That was the biggest deposit she'd received so far. And she had earned every Naira with her own vision, her own hands, and her own name. No one called her Daniel's wife anymore. Now, they called her Madam Grace. Later that night, she sat on her balcony sipping Zobo from a wine glass, watching the stars stretch across the sky. Her phone buzzed. "Daniel, are you okay? I miss you." She read it. Didn't reply. Because for the first time in months, she was more than okay. She was becoming who she was before the silence. Before the pressure. Before the be quiet and obey expectations. She closed her laptop and whispered to herself, "I didn't leave to prove a point. I left to find my peace." And the woman who once stood quietly in another woman's shadow was now standing fully in her own light. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was harsh, and traffic was crawling along the expressway like it had nowhere better to be. Daniel sat in the back seat of his car, suit jacket off, phone in hand. His mind was elsewhere, a meeting that ran too long, another deal that didn't go through, and the strange hollow that hadn't left his chest in weeks. He hadn't spoken to Grace since she left. He told himself he was giving her space. The truth? He was afraid she might be doing fine without him. As the car inched forward, his driver tapped the brakes. "Olga, look up," he said with a half-smile, pointing toward the large LED billboard ahead. Daniel looked, and what he saw knocked the breath out of his lungs. High above the road, bold and beaming, was Grace. Her photo radiated elegance, standing in a modern living room she had designed, arms crossed, confidence in her eyes. The banner read, "Graceful Spaces, redefining living in every home." Book today. Below it was her business logo, her website, her face. Daniel blinked. It wasn't the image that hit hardest. It was the light in her eyes, that unshakable calm, the glow that only comes from a woman who's no longer asking for permission to exist. He stared in silence as the billboard passed them by, growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But the regret? That grew larger with every second. His mother had warned him that Grace would destroy his peace. But all she'd ever done was ask for space to love him on her terms. And when she couldn't have it, she built something for herself instead. He sank back into the seat, heart pounding. The silence in the car grew louder. That night, back at the house, he sat in the living room staring at the walls Grace once tried to beautify. They were still dull, still cold. The flower vase was gone. The warmth was gone. The woman was gone. He scrolled through her social media pages in silence. Photos of her at project sites, smiling with clients, speaking on panels. She wasn't just surviving. She was soaring. Mrs. Agnes walked in, holding her cup of evening tea. "You're quiet today," she said. Daniel didn't reply. She took a sip. "Good riddance. She would have dimmed your light." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, he saw just how dark the room had become. Because the only light he'd ever needed was the one he let walk away. Daniel hesitated outside the cafe for almost 10 minutes before going in. He had messaged her the night before. "Can we talk? Just once. I need to say what I should have said back then." To his surprise, Grace replied with a time and a place. No emojis. No warmth. Just 1 p.m. Lincoln Cafe. 15 minutes only. Now, seated at the corner table, Daniel's heart raced like he was at a job interview. He sipped water, checked his watch, adjusted his sleeves. And when the glass door opened, there she was. Grace. She walked in wearing a soft blue blouse, her hair tied back neatly, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Her steps were confident, her eyes calm. There was no sadness in her face. Just a woman who had healed and moved on. "Hi, Daniel," she said, sliding into the seat opposite him. He smiled faintly. "You look incredible." "Thank you," she replied, setting her bag down. "Let's talk." He paused, unsure how to begin. "I've made mistakes." Grace nodded once. "Yes, you have. I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping peace. I didn't see how much of you I was asking to disappear." Grace folded her hands on the table. "You didn't ask me to disappear, Daniel. You stood by and watched while someone else pushed me out of your life." He lowered his head. "I miss you. I believe you. I want another chance." Grace leaned back. "To love me? Or to fix your guilt?" Daniel blinked. "I didn't meet you here to go back," she said firmly. "I came because I needed you to see the version of me that wasn't afraid to leave." He stared at her, pain in his eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said, rising from her chair. "And thank your mother for setting me free." Then she walked out, heels clicking on the tiled floor like punctuation marks on a chapter already closed. Mrs. Agnes stood by the front gate, arms folded, barking instructions at the gardener about how to trim the hedge, even though it had already been trimmed that morning. She was restless, irritable. Daniel hadn't been himself in weeks, and the house had grown too quiet, too clean, too hollow. Meals were prepared, but barely touched. The laughter she used to hear echo from the upstairs room had vanished. She would never admit it out loud, but the house felt colder without Grace. Then she heard it, the low hum of an approaching car. She turned around casually and froze. A sleek, deep gray SUV pulled up to the curb. The window slid down, and there she was, Grace. Only this Grace wasn't in modest dresses or polite silence. She wore a bold orange blazer, gold studs in her ears, and a calm, unreadable expression. She stepped out slowly, heels clicking confidently on the pavement, her branded company folder tucked beneath her arm. She didn't need to smile. Her presence spoke. A second car pulled in behind hers, younger designers unloading sample boards and decor pieces. Mrs. Agnes blinked, confused, speechless. Daniel stepped outside just as the front door opened. He walked down the steps cautiously. "You came?" Grace nodded once. "Your firm requested a design proposal. I almost declined, but professionalism won." Before Daniel could respond, Mrs. Agnes found her voice. "You're here for business?" Yes, Grace said without missing a beat. That's all this is. She turned to the assistants behind her. Set up near the foyer. We'll do the presentation in the main hall. Mrs. Agnes stepped forward. You're not back? Grace met her gaze calmly. I didn't come to return. I came to renovate. She turned and walked inside, flanked by her team, her posture tall and untouchable. And for the first time ever, Mrs. Agnes wasn't just looking at a daughter-in-law. She was looking at a woman. She could no longer command, no longer intimidate, and no longer dismiss. The presentation went flawlessly. Grace stood before the large-screen projection, walking the team through her design plans for the company's new executive lounge. Daniel's firm staff listened intently, taking notes. No one asked about her past. No one saw her as the ex-wife. They saw her for what she had become, a woman of vision, skill, and quiet power. When the final slide clicked into place, she thanked them professionally, packed up her files, and turned to leave. But Mrs. Agnes stood blocking the front door. Grace stopped. For a moment, they just looked at each other. No assistants. No team. No Daniel. Just the two women who once lived under the same roof. In an invisible war for control. Mrs. Agnes opened her mouth. You think because you have a car and clients, you've won? Grace stepped forward slowly, stopping just a few feet away. Her voice was calm, even gentle. I never came here to win. I came to live. She tilted her head. But you made this a battlefield, and you demanded I surrender. And when I didn't, you asked your son to choose. Agnes's expression stiffened. Grace continued, her words like soft hammers on a wall. You tried to control me, but all you did was lose your own son in the process. Agnes opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Grace gave her a nod, not bitter, not arrogant. Just final. I hope one day you realize love isn't ownership. It's partnership. Then she reached for the door handle, paused, and added, and when your silence fills this house again tonight, I hope it reminds you of what your pride cost you. She walked out, heels clicking against the marble, her presence trailing behind her like perfume. And Mrs. Agnes? She remained at the door, staring at the emptiness Grace left behind. Not because it was loud, but because it was undeniably hers. The house was still spotless, polished floors, fluffed pillows, curtains drawn just so. But it no longer felt grand. It felt empty. Mrs. Agnes sat alone at the breakfast table, her cup of tea growing cold between her fingers. The housekeeper stood nearby, waiting for instructions, but none came. There was nothing left to arrange. Nothing left to control. Daniel had moved out 2 weeks ago, not with an argument, but with a simple sentence. I need to find peace, and I can't find it here anymore. He didn't say Grace's name, but he didn't need to. He left his keys on the table, packed a single duffel bag, and walked out. Just like that. And now Agnes sat in the house she once ruled, alone with the echoes of her own voice. Meanwhile, across town, Grace stood in a glittering ballroom, microphone in hand, delivering a keynote at the Women Who Build Summit. She wore a sleek emerald green suit, hair swept into a regal bun, her voice clear and assured. They told me to shrink. But instead, I built something bigger than their fear. The audience applauded, standing to their feet as her logo flashed behind her. Graceful spaces, now in 8 cities. 3 countries. 1 vision. A local news outlet ran the headline the next morning. From daughter-in-law to industry leader. How one woman chose herself and won. Mrs. Agnes saw the article while sipping tea. She stared at the photo of Grace on the cover, smiling, surrounded by staff, admired. The woman she once ordered to be silent was now being handed microphones. A knock came at the door. It was the gardener. Madam, should we refresh the flowers by the gate? Agnes looked at the gate. The flowers were still blooming, but her world had withered. She waved him off. No, let them die. And as the door closed again, she sat back in her chair, staring at the walls she once protected like a throne, now nothing more than reminders of the woman who walked away and took the light with her. Once upon a time, in a grand house at the end of a quiet street, lived a woman who believed that love meant control, and that motherhood gave her ownership over every room, every plate, every word spoken within those walls. And for a while, no one dared challenge her. Her son obeyed. The housekeeper whispered. And when a new bride entered the home, soft-spoken and respectful, the older woman smiled. Not in welcome, but in warning. Because in her mind, There could never be two queens in one palace. She measured respect by silence, and submission by how quickly a daughter-in-law folded under her gaze. But this new bride? She didn't shout. She didn't fight. She simply began to draw a quiet line around her peace. And that line, to a woman used to ruling, felt like rebellion. So the mother-in-law gave her son a choice. If she won't bow to me, send her away. And the son, not out of hatred, but weakness, let the crown fall into the wrong hands. But what none of them realized was this. When a woman walks away quietly, she often returns stronger than anyone expects. She left without drama. She carried no vengeance. She simply packed her strength and built a kingdom elsewhere, while the house she left behind stayed neat, but hollow. The one who pushed her out sat alone, day after day, sipping pride like cold tea, wondering why the echo of power was louder than the presence of love. Meanwhile, the woman they dismissed stood tall before crowds, led teams, transformed lives, and built beauty out of the very silence they once mistook for weakness. And when they finally saw her again, radiant, unstoppable, they no longer saw a daughter-in-law. They saw a legacy they could no longer lay claim to. Because the moment they tried to control her, they lost something far more valuable. Her presence, her loyalty, her light. So hear this, and remember it well. To the mothers who confuse control for wisdom, be careful. You may raise a son, but that does not mean you own his home. To the men who can't draw a line between love and loyalty, know this. If you can't protect your wife from battles she didn't start, don't be surprised when she stops waiting for you to pick a side. And to every woman reading this, if they silence your voice, build with your hands. If they push you out, rise where they can't follow. You don't need to win the war, just walk away with your peace. Because sometimes, the loudest victory is leaving with your dignity and returning with a crown they never saw coming. If this story spoke to your soul, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, truth-filled folktales that remind you of your worth, your voice, and your power. The next story might just be yours.